Hi, my name is Cameron Martel, and I am a PhD candidate in the marketing group here at Sloan. And I'm really excited to talk about some of my doctoral research today, specifically dealing with the interplay between partisan motives and misinformation. So as you may know, there's been a lot of concern in recent years about the spread of misinformation and harmfully misleading content, particularly on social media. And I think it's really important to take a look at this issue, especially when it comes to really important and politicized topics such as election integrity and vaccine safety. So what have social media companies been doing in the past to address this type of information? Primarily what they've done is partner with third-party fact-checkers to help identify, label, and then eventually downrank content that fact-checkers find to be false or misleading. However, there's some issues with this approach. The first that has been a long-standing issue is that there are a limited number of these external experts and fact-checkers. They take a lot of time to review these cases of misinformation. It can take multiple days once fact-checkers have even decided to review a specific piece of content. And all the while, misinformation can keep being produced. And more recently, due to pushback, particularly from those on the political right, different social media companies have actually been phasing out their partnerships with third-party fact-checkers altogether. Most recently, back in January, Meta announced that it would be ending its partnership in the US with third-party fact-checkers on Facebook and Instagram. And all the while, this might result in these really important misleading pieces of content about things like election integrity and vaccine safety being able to spread and be believed on social media platforms without any form of content moderation on them. So the question that I want to focus on today, and that I think is really important for these types of platforms to grapple with, is how can we identify misinformation at scale? If there are fact-checkers, how can we kind of fill the gaps in the current moderation practices by getting more eyeballs on more different types of content to see if it's potentially misleading and some action should be taken? And if there are no fact-checkers at all, what are other alternative ways of doing content moderation that might be able to address really important types of content spreading on these platforms? The solution that I'm going to talk about draws from years of work on the wisdom of crowds, so the idea that the average of multiple people's estimates of something tends to be more accurate than any given individual's estimate, as well as years of work on different forms of collective intelligence online. So think your Wikipedia or your different online review systems like Google's local guides or Yelp. And the idea is, can we take something like a collective intelligence approach, and can we point it in the direction of trying to identify potentially false or harmfully misleading content on social media? And actually, different forms of this have been attempted and suggested. So several years ago now, Facebook tried something that was a community review program. This was to recruit lay people to also evaluate the veracity of content that would help rank what would then be sent to fact-checkers eventually. But even this still relies on some internal flagging of what might be misleading to send it out, and deals with these similar latency times that we see from the fact-checker content moderation program. So what's a way to make this even more scalable, to get even more people potentially involved in being able to weigh in with their own individual knowledge of what may or may not be accurate or inaccurate? X, then Twitter at the time, started a program called Community Notes, where essentially as users are on their timelines, if they see a tweet that they think is misleading or needs additional context, they could classify it as such and classify it as misleading, and then write a free response note or a fact check explaining what additional context would be needed and used to inform other users viewing that content. And actually, later in this talk, we'll be looking at some data from Community Notes to see how well this approach might be working. And just to note, this type of Community Notes program is spreading and being more popular across different platforms. Several months ago, YouTube announced a very similar program. And Meta, in its announcement saying that it was ending its partnership with third-party fact-checkers, said they were going to replace this with a Community Notes structured platform, and actually just yesterday announced that they are now beta testing it. So it's really important to think really critically about how to design these systems, what inputs are going to be in there, and who may or may not be participating. And so if you recall, I said it's really important to think especially about important types of content, political issues like election integrity, vaccine safety. And if that's the case and we care about that political content, Well, it might be an issue if we're relying on lay people who have perhaps political motivations, especially those with the strongest political motivations, to review this type of content. What if the people who are really strongly partisan motivated are undermining this system? So just to briefly talk a little bit about the theoretical framework here. Zooming out, what informs how people engage with information and content to begin with? There's a lot of work in political psychology suggesting that people choose how to engage with content based on what they're motivated, either based on their identity or partisanship, to believe or act on. And specifically in the case of misinformation, this has been framed in a direct trade-off, like a zero-sum trade-off between accuracy motivation, so if you want to be accurate, and these identity or partisan motivations if you want to do something that serves your political side. And so even empirically, different studies have shown that if you're boosting one, you're taking away from the other. So if you're making people more motivated by accuracy, they're going to be less partisan biased. Or if you're making people more partisan, they're going to be less accurate. And I think this is really troubling because if it's even been suggested that why people share misinformation in the first place is due to these political identities. And you might think something really similar could be happening to why people choose to flag content in a crowdsourced fact-checking system. So just to lay it out, what motivates how people might engage with information, particularly in this flagging system? Well, the current theory of this motivated action taking would suggest that these partisan accuracy motives are competing with one another, that if accuracy motivations win, then great. Individuals will be accurate and unbiased. However, if partisan motives win, then individuals will be inaccurate and biased. What I want to do here is critically examine whether this is the case, whether this is what happens when we look at the actual data, and suggest perhaps a theoretical alternative. So is it really the case that politically motivated individuals are engaging inaccurately, as that would predict, with the information that they encounter? If so, that would severely undermine the efficacy of crowdsourced fact-checking. And these were the very concerns that when Twitter announced what was then called Birdwatch, now Community Notes, that different political pundits and professors and professional fact-checkers had being concerned that these lay people flaggers would not be able to flag accurately because of these biases that they have. So the first major concern that we might have with such a crowdsourced fact-checking system is what if people are motivated by partisanship instead of by accuracy when they're deciding what content to flag on social media. So to lay out what this might look like and to critically investigate this, suppose that you have 4 really basic types of content. So content can vary on veracity, it can be true or false, and it can vary on political alignment. It can be concordant, so in line with your beliefs, a Republican viewing pro-Republican or anti-democratic content, or politically discordant, it disagrees with you, a Republican viewing anti-Republican or pro-democratic content. So if you have people that for whom accuracy motives kind of win out, then great, they'll just flag falsehoods regardless of its political alignment with their political identity. However, you might have strong partisan zealots, which under this zero-sum like trade-off model would just be flagging stuff regardless of veracity that they disagree with. And this is kind of what we might be worried about here. However, I think what's interesting when you lay it out this way is if it's actually the case that rather than in these two motivations are directly in conflict, they can be separable, and people can have both partisan and accuracy motives that can contribute to their flagging decisions, then you might expect actually there's convergence in that discordant false category, where people might be motivated to flag stuff perhaps not only if it's false, not only if it's discordant, but especially if it's both of them at the same time. To lay out what these predictions might look like. So if accuracy and partisan motives are truly in conflict, then you might expect that strongly politically motivated users will flag discordant content regardless of its veracity. What this could look like is if you have concordant true and concordant false content here, there's very little flagging of that because people don't want to flag stuff that's agreeable to them, and a lot of flagging regardless of veracity for stuff that is disagreeable. And this would be bad. This gives us very poor discernment between knowing if people are flagging stuff that actually should deserve a flag or not. However, if people, even those who are really strongly partisan motivated, can hold both of these to some extent, you would expect still the most discordant false flagging. However, if there's some utility gained by flagging stuff that's false, even when it's agreeable, you would expect more flagging of that type of content. And if there's some kind of disutility associated with flagging stuff that is true, even if it is disagreeable, you would expect less flagging of that discordant true category. So that's our first question. Is this a trade-off between the two motives, or might they actually be able to work work in synergy with one another to motivate flagging, particularly of this discordant false category. A second major concern that we might have about this system overall is that it introduces a public goods game, meaning that writing fact checks, it takes time, it takes effort, but it's contributing a benefit to others who are going to see these fact checks. So what if not enough people flag anything at all? Why should people be motivated at all to begin with? And a lot of this stems from the work on the reviews, in reviews literature. Why should anyone be flagging? Who might be doing the flagging? So do users who are very politically motivated flag content simply because they disagree with it, or are they flagging inaccurate content in particular? And who's actually doing this flagging? Might it be the case that actually the more politically motivated individuals are kind of carrying the load of the system? Are they doing even more work? And if so, it's really critical to answer that first question of if they're doing a good job at all. So we're going to turn to some data both from an online lab setting and from social media field data from X's community notes. So first, taking a look at the survey data, this is going to be about 2,000 American participants that we gave a news feed to scroll through, and they could flag stuff if they think that it is false and deserves some type of additional context. If not, they could just scroll right past it. Participants saw different true stimuli, false stimuli, and kind of entertainment stimuli. And these stimuli varied and were balanced on if they were co-partisan or counter-partisan, as well as true or false as laid out. This is what it looks like in practice. Users can just scroll through the feed that they see, simulating what a kind of flagging environment might look like. Anything they don't want to flag, they can just skip right past. Anything they do want to flag, they stop. They would flag it, and then they're required to write at least a couple words. It's kind of like the cost of this public goods game framework as to why. So what does overall flagging look like? As expected, we're going to see very little flagging of entertainment and concordant true content. We're going to see the most flagging as predicted by that kind of convergence approach of our discordant false flagging. But what's really important and interesting, I think, is what's happening in these middle two categories. And overall, at least, what we find is still a lot, though not quite as much flagging as the discordant false for concordant false flagging. And promisingly, not that much flagging of the disagreeable but true content. However, our main question is what's happening across partisan motives? What are the really strong partisans doing? And so we're going to have an index of different features such as out-party animosity, issue polarization, and political knowledge, and look what's happening for those who are really strongly politically motivated. Again, we're going to find very little flagging of our entertainment and concordant true stuff, but way more flagging, and especially of those who are highly politically motivated, of the discordant false content. Now, what's happening in the middle? You might remember that there was a lot of flagging of the concordant false stuff. Maybe it's kind of these less politically motivated folks who are doing that. However, what we see is it's still the more politically motivated individuals who are even flagging the agreeable false stuff, and still very little flagging of the discordant true content overall. But it could be the case that we're kind of in a setting where accuracy motives are stronger and partisan motives are weaker. So what's actually happening in the field where that might not be the case? So now we're going to turn to data from community notes from the initial 6-month pilot of this, where again, users could see a tweet. They can label it as potentially misleading. We're going to focus on those potentially misleading labels. And what it would look like is at the time you had a kind of classification of potentially misleading here, and that free response note that you could write below. We're then going to take a look at this initial data set of notes. First and foremost, it's important to see that only 25% of the initial users actually contributed any notes at all. That really underscores the importance of trying to figure out who is contributing and what might be motivating them to do so. Otherwise, we're not going to solve that scalability issue. We're going to hire fact checkers to fact check a subset of tweets that were flagged by users so that we can compare relative to some ground truth measure how well these note writers are doing at flagging stuff. We're going to estimate the partisan lean of the tweet based on MTurk ratings of that, and infer the partisanship of the Twitter user who wrote the note based on the accounts that they follow. So we're still going to be able to get that concordant and discordant kind of overall framework and mapping. So I'm going to skip ahead to what it looks like when we kind of look across our partisan motivations. So what are the really strong partisans doing relative to the weaker partisans as measured by kind of the absolute value of that partisanship score that we inferred? Well, as we might expect, we're going to see very little flagging of that concordant true. Why you probably wouldn't flag anything that's true and agreeable to you. We would next predict the most flagging of the discordant false category, especially for those who are more politically extreme, which is what we find here. That's kind of where the bulk of our flagging is coming from. But what's happening in the middle? Unlike in our survey setting, we're going to see a lot less flagging of the concordant false content. That might be due to these different motivations or kind of different settings that we're looking at. But I think what's critical for determining if the system is, if the inputs in the system are any good, is this discordant true category. Are the more politically extreme individuals also flagging a lot more of the discordant true content? And what we see is there is a small increase, but that increase is very much offset by the increase in flagging of the discordant false category, such that the more extreme partisans are flagging even more of the discordant false content as they are the discordant true content. So just to wrap it up, what this would mean is that there's about 80% agreement with fact checkers for tweets that were evaluated as misleading. And this was true for both those less and more politically extreme. But if you were designing a system and you were worried about these politically extreme individuals, you wouldn't want to just get rid of them because they're having the same quality of fact checking as the less extreme folks, but they're doing double the work. It would just eliminate kind of 2/3 of the notes to your system. And that would really undermine the overall goal of filling that scalability gap that we mentioned. So just to wrap up, professional fact-checking can't keep up or is being phased out, but maybe we can use the collective intelligence of users to help platforms identify misinformation at scale. But this creates a public goods problem. Why should you rate anything at all? Now, it could be the case that politically motivated users are going to rate stuff, but they might be really bad at it. But what we find here is that contrary to that kind of motivated reasoning approach, political motivations might be able to work in tandem with accuracy motives, such that politically motivated users can uphold the quantity of fact checks without harming the quality. So in sum, our crowdsourced fact-checking system might be able to work because of, rather than in spite of, these users with really strong political motives. So a huge thank you to my co-authors and to the judges and all of you for listening today. Thanks so much.